네, 안녕하세요. 저는 리움 미술관 교육연구실장 구정현입니다. 사실 이번 주가 프리즈 기간이고 다양한 이제 곳에서 전시가 많이 일어나고 있는데 그럼에도 불구하고 저희 미술관과 저희 이 컨퍼런스에 찾아주셔서 정말 진심으로 감사드립니다. 오늘 자리는 그 리움 미술관 퍼블릭 프로그램 아이디어 뮤지엄의 일환으로 마련되었고요. 아이디어 뮤지엄은 저희가 매년 하나의 주제를 선정을 해서 그 주제를 중심으로 예술가와 연구자, 학자들, 다양한 분들을 모시고 중요한 의제들을 하나를 선정을 해서 관련해서 논의하고 어떤 형식적인 실험들을 하는 프로젝트로 기획이 되었습니다. 특히 이제 무엇보다 기후와 어떤 환경 재난이라는 시대적 전환 속에서 미술관이 앞으로 어떤 미래와 어떤 역할을 해나가는지에 대한 고민을 하기 위해서 마련되었습니다. 특히 이러한 어떤 여정에 또 샤넬 컬처 펀드가 함께 해주셔서 지금까지 3년째 저희가 든든한 어떤 지원과 지지를 받고 운영을 해오고 있습니다. 이번 사이클 아이디어 뮤지엄 같은 경우에는 작년 저희가 11월 열흘간 열렸던 사회 어딘가에 같이 이제 연결되어 있습니다. 사회 어딘가의 심포지엄 같은 경우에는 젠더와 다양성을 키워드로 인간과 비인간, 자연과 문화, 여성과 남성, 삶과 죽음, 장애와 비장애 등 다양한 경계사의 심연에 이제 주목하면서 그런 어떤 혼종적인 공간에서 펼쳐지는 가능성을 모색해 보았습니다. 이번 아이디어 이제 뮤지엄 9월 프로그램 같은 경우에는 미국 LA 기반으로 현재 활동 중인 아티스트 듀오 라시다 필립스와 카미 아에아가 공동으로 설립한 블랙컨더 퓨처리즘을 초청해서 그들이 오랫동안 해왔던 연구 프로젝트인 타임존 프로토콜을 선보이게 되었습니다. 특히 이 서울이라는 장소를 배경으로 이와 연계해서 열리는 본초자오선 컨퍼런스 프로그램 같은 경우에는 블랙컨터 퓨처리즘이 계속해서 연계온 시간성에 대한 문제와 아시아의 시간성을 서로 이제 교차시켜서 서로 만나는 지점을 탐색해 보고자 합니다. 특히 이번 프로그램 같은 경우에는 서로 다른 시간이 공존하는 세계를 상상하고 실험해 봄으로써 각기 다른 역사와 문화가 빚어낸 시간과 감각, 리듬은 물론 인간을 넘어선 존재들이 살아가는 시간까지 이해하는 계기가 되기를 바랍니다. 마지막으로 아까 이제 저희 팁바를 설치해서 티를 이제 즐기셨는데요. 저희가 3일 동안 팁바가 설치될 예정이고 3일간 여정에 다양한 티들을 이제 음미해 볼 수 있다는 거 다시 한번 말씀드리고 그와 동시에 그 블랙컨더 퓨처리즘에 만든 티를 위한 리추얼 엽서가 마련되어 있습니다. 함께 보시면서 차를 마시면서 뭔가 명상의 시간, 사색의 시간을 즐기시기 바랍니다. 그럼 이번 서울 언컨퍼런스의 포문을 여는 첫 강연에 대해서 설명해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 블랙컨터 퓨처리즘의 라시다 필립스의 시간의 프로토콜 다시 쓰기, 본초자오선 너머의 시간적 정의입니다. 라시다 필립스는 퀴어 주권가 활동가이자 양육자, 저술가, 다학제적 예술가, 문화 프로듀서로서 웹 기반 프로젝트, 진, 단편 영화, 아카이브 실전, 실험적 논픽션, 사변적 소설, 퍼포먼스, 사회적 실천 등 다양한 어떤 연구를 통해서 시간과 시간성들, 공동체의 미래주의적 개념을 탐구해 왔습니다. 이 모든 활동은 흑인 미래주의와 관계된 문화적 시각과 경험을 기반으로 하고 있습니다. 또한 필립스는 폴립시 링크의 주거 담당 디렉터로서 미국 전역에서 풀뿌리 단체와 사회운동 리더들, 산업계 및 정부 관계자들과 협력하여 점차 확대되고 있는 쟁점인 세입자 권리, 주거, 토지 이용과 관련된 정책 지원 활동을 이끌고 있습니다. 필립스의 강연은 저희가 한 1시간 정도 진행될 예정인데요. 제국 표준화 그리고 1884년 국제자오선 회의에 의해 형성된 선형적 서구시간 개념에 도전할 것을 제안합니다. 시간적 정의와 회복의 관점을 통해 본 강연은 다양한 지형, 우주론, 공동체를 경유하며 시간을 살고 감각하며 설계하는 대안적 방식을 탐색하고자 합니다. 강연 이후에는 간단하게 한 30-40분 정도 토론과 그 객석의 어떤 질의응답을 통해서 별도의 시간을 가질 예정이라는 점 말씀드립니다. 그러면 바로 강연을 시작을 하도록 하겠습니다.
Rewriting the Protocols of Time, Temporal Justice Beyond the Prime Meridian. Time reckoning, like weather and like politics, has historically been a local practice, relying on local timekeeping methods. Humans have gazed up at the skies throughout the ages, using a number of devices to trace the patterns of the stars, the sun's rising and setting, and the cycling of seasons in order to measure the passage of time. As societies grew, traveled, and traded with each other, mathematicians began to unravel the complexities of time measurement, devising intricate calculations and equations that were scrawled on scrolls and manuscripts, and eventually used to craft the clocks that we know today. The rapid expansion of commerce and travel, the growth of global capitalism, and the maintenance of global colonization by European nations over their colonized territories increasingly require clock and calendar time standardization. Eventually, power brokers negotiated and adopted a universal standard of time across industries, forcing nations and cultures to submit to a single global standard. Today, a system of 24 time zones is used to not only synchronize activities across and between continents, but also to control the activities and daily lives of billions across the globe. In the mid-1800s, the idea that the world would be divided into time zones was first introduced. When delegates from 25 countries gathered in Washington, D.C. for the International Meridian Conference in the year 1884, they determined that the Greenwich Meridian in southeast London would be the world's prime meridian, or the 0-degree longitude line of geographical reference, making it the standard reference point from which all of the world's 24 time zones were created. The International Meridian Conference is a critical point on the Western timeline for understanding the backward and the forward-reaching impacts of time standardization and its resulting temporal oppression, the collapsing of natural time into capitalist time in ways that fundamentally shifts humans' experience of and relationship to time itself. The International Meridian Conference's decision had reality-altering political, legal, and social implications and consequences. Britain was chosen as the epicenter for a global timekeeping system, representing a reaffirmation of Western-centric power dynamics, and with it, a new way of perceiving and interacting with time. Before the international time zones and a single prime meridian to rule the globe was established, cracking the mystery of accurate longitude measurement was a necessary first step in man's conquering of space-time. The development of advanced timekeeping technologies, including the chronometer, was pivotal in the expansion of European empires during the 19th century. These technologies enabled European explorers and traders to navigate the world's oceans more accurately, which facilitated the colonization and exploitation of distant lands. Clocks, time, maps, and global imperialism are intimately bound. Historian Giordani Nani notes, the science of horology was instrumental in the exploration and charting of the oceans and in the discovery of the so-called New World. The colonization of Australia and Africa was enabled by the search for the invention of a device that could accurately measure longitude, making the clock as essential to colonization as the ship. For centuries, sailors struggled to determine their longitude when navigating the sea. Latitude, a ship's position north or south of the equator, can be determined pretty easily by observing the angle of the sun or the North Star. However, determining longitude, or a ship's position east or west of a reference point, was much more difficult. Not having an accurate longitude measure significantly reduced navigational precision at sea, thereby increasing the risks associated with unknown coastlines, hazardous reefs, and other navigational hazards. Sailors would often use a combination of hourglasses to measure time and a rope with knots to measure distance. But these methods often led to inaccuracies and land masses showing up in unexpected places. Before the 17th century, clocks were large and expensive, and they were typically owned and operated by wealthy people or by institutions such as governments or churches. It was not until after Dutch scientist Christian Huygens invented the pendulum clock in 1656 that clocks began to become more accurate and more affordable, making them more widely available to the general public. These early devices, however, were not fit for sea travel and rough ocean waves. Sailors often had to rely on estimates or unreliable devices that were frequently inaccurate or deteriorated and rusted on the rough journeys. Ships often were unable to return to their home ports after long voyages. Over nearly 2 centuries, rivaling imperial nations offered large financial rewards, and prestige to whomever could develop a practical and reliable method for measuring longitude. This included Spain in 1567 and 1598, and the Dutch Republic in 1600. Galileo even worked on the problem without success, and Isaac Newton said no clockwork would succeed in finding longitude. The longitude problem became a popular obsession for people across nations, ranging from renowned scientists to inventors to those considered scammers and madmen. And a slang term even emerged, the longitude lunatics. Later, in the 1600s, France and Britain tried to find another solution to the longitude problem by building observatories to assist sailors and navigators in making accurate astronomical maps and charts. France was first up with the establishment of the Paris Observatory in 1667, and then a few years later, in 1675, came Greenwich Observatory in London. Both observatories eventually came to play an important role in the age of exploration that brought the conquest, colonization, and exploitation of nations around the world. The Greenwich Observatory's main instrument was the quadrant, a large measuring device used to determine the positions of celestial objects, providing the foundation for accurate navigational charts and improving the safety of long-distance voyages. However, the problem still had not been fully resolved by the erection of expensive observatories and new instruments. In 1707, for instance, 4 warships in an English fleet were wrecked due to bad weather and miscalculation of longitude, with an estimated loss of 1,400 to 2,000 sailors. Large financial rewards and prestige were offered by rivaling nations for whomever could develop a practical and reliable method for measuring longitude. The Longitude Prize was one such competition for a sum of $20,000 from the British Parliament in 1714, worth about $5 million today, for anyone who could determine longitude within 1/2 of a degree of accuracy, or a margin of error of no more than 3 seconds every 24 hours. British clockmaker John Harrison threw his hat into the ring. Harrison had spent many years studying the problem of longitude and concluded that an accurate timepiece was the key to solving it. In 1730, Harrison built the first marine chronometer, which he called H1. H1 was a large, heavy instrument that used a balance wheel and spring to regulate its timekeeping. Although it was accurate, it was too bulky to be used on ships. Over the next few decades, Harrison continued to refine his design, building smaller and more accurate sea clocks, watches, marine timekeepers, and chronometers. His H4 marine chronometer, which he completed in 1759, was a breakthrough. It was small enough to be carried on a ship. It was less subject to deterioration, and it was highly accurate, matching land-based clocks within a few seconds per day. The chronometer had a quick and profound impact on navigation. With an accurate chronometer, sailors could determine their longitude by comparing the time on the ship's chronometer with the time at a known reference point, such as the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, London. With this tool, ships could more accurately pilot their course and avoid getting lost or crashing, which allowed for longer and more extensive sea voyages. This in turn enabled colonization, exploration, and trade with other continents. A replica of Harrison's H4 chronometer, called the K1, would eventually be used to help complete Captain James Cook's second and third voyages to Sydney Cove, Australia. After Cook's voyages, the British government commissioned further expeditions to explore and chart the coast of Australia, with the aim of claiming the land for the British Empire. In 1788, the first fleet arrived in Botany Bay, New South Wales, establishing the first British colony on Australian soil. This marked the beginning of European settlement in Australia, eventually leading to the displacement and dispossession of indigenous Australians. Cook's voyages to Australia also had wider geopolitical implications, giving Britain a new significant territory to claim and to exploit, helping to cement its position as a major global power. Chronometers were also a crucial technological development that aided in the exploration, exploitation, and mapping of Africa by imperial interests. Chronometers enabled explorers and cartographers to create more accurate maps of all the continents. David Livingstone, a Scottish explorer, considered to be one of the first medical missionaries to travel throughout Africa, used a chronometer to accurately determine his longitude, and his surveys and maps of the continent helped fill in gaps in the existing knowledge of Africa. The British Empire also commissioned Henry Morton Stanley to lead a number of expeditions to explore Africa and map its resources. In a clockwork Newtonian universe where God is the ultimate clockmaker, setting the 0 point for the world's time was the earthly counterpart and institutionalization of a godlike infinite power over time and space. On the surface, the creation of time zones was an attempt to create a unified system of time measurement that would simplify communication, transportation, and trade. However, it was also an exercise in power. International time zones emerged as part of a larger imperial project and a reflection of the prevailing power structures of that era. It also functioned as an assertion of the West's dominance over other regions and the enforcement of its own standards and values around the world. From October 1st to October 22nd, 1884, 41 all-male and mostly white delegates from 25 countries in diplomatic relationships with the United States convened in Washington, D.C. They did this by an act of U.S. Congress to fix on and recommend for universal adoption a common prime meridian to be used in the reckoning of longitude and in the regulation of time throughout the world. That was their mission. The purpose of the conference was to determine a single prime meridian or a reference line from which longitude would be calculated for the entire world. It would eventually be used as the basis for standard time zones for the coordination of global transport and communication. At one point, there were at least 20 prime meridians in the world. At the time of the International Meridian Conference, many different prime meridians were still in use, including the meridian that runs through the Royal Observatory in Greenwich and the meridian through the Paris Observatory in France. The United States utilized two at that time. One in Washington, D.C. for astronomical observations, which was known as the American Meridian. And then the Royal Observatory in Greenwich for geography and navigation. The International Meridian Conference was meant to be a formality where diplomats from the world's most powerful nations could come together to confirm what had already been decided at two previous conferences, the Geographical Congress at Venice in 1881 and a meeting of the Geodetic Association at Rome in 1883. There they had already decided where the universal meridian would be, that it would lie in the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. The International Meridian Conference resulted in a formalization of 7 resolutions laid out in the final act of its protocol proceedings. It included a recommendation for the official adoption of the Royal Observatory as the prime meridian and a recommendation to rearrange the astronomical and nautical days to begin at mean midnight. The conference established the Greenwich Meridian as the global standard of time. This meant that all time zones would be based on the Greenwich Meridian, allowing people to calculate time differences between locations. The conference also established the 24-hour clock, which we still use today. The International Meridian Conference was ill-planned and politically fraught among the various nations. During the conference and after, some nations argued that they should not have to adapt to Greenwich Mean Time. Nations like France and Brazil abstained from the final vote to fix the meridian in Greenwich, while San Domingo, now known as the Dominican Republic, voted against it. France wanted a neutral meridian that did not pass across any continent, but delegates at the Meridian Conference said they had no authority to commit their nations to any resolutions. Some countries chose to ignore the conference's declarations, instead choosing to adopt a time zone based on their own observatories and the time of their capital cities. These countries often refer to this as local mean time to differentiate it from Greenwich Mean Time. Although the resolutions were not immediately adopted or acted on by many countries, given that they had no authority, some countries did begin setting their time in accordance with Greenwich Mean Time about a decade after the conference. And by 1929, most major countries in the world had accepted the time zones. The establishment of Greenwich Meridian as the world's prime meridian in 1884 had significant consequences for the rest of the world. It placed Britain as the center of a global timekeeping system, perpetuating the idea of British superiority and reinforcing the notion that British customs and laws should be adopted by other countries. All other longitudes were measured relative to the Greenwich prime meridian, and countries around the world had to adjust their standard time zones to align with the new reference point. The International Meridian Conference established that meridian as the universal barometer of time, and in tandem with its spatial counterpart, the Berlin Conference prodded the standardization of timekeeping to foster a global system of space-time that encourages capitalism, white supremacy, and has a stranglehold over the world. Consequently, the uniformity of time zones blazed the trail for telecommunications network and industrial capitalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which unsurprisingly facilitated the economic and political conditions that maintained and grew colonialism and imperialism in many parts of the world. The agreements that were made at that conference have had immense implications that extend far beyond navigation. They created a new form of colonial power structure over time, establishing a single global temporal reference point, essentially flattened all other forms of timekeeping, communal, personal, spiritual, into that which serves a state and global and economic functions. This temporal colonialism has ushered in the current era of globalization, where different cultures are increasingly interconnected under one universal concept of time and space. Two geography professors demonstrate how the concept of time zones alters our natural understanding of time. Instead of following the natural day and night cycle, time zones organize us into a system that doesn't always match up with the sunlight that is visible to us. These zones are supposed to cover areas of the Earth 15 degrees apart in longitude, but instead, they often follow political borders instead of strict geographic lines. This means that some places use a time zone that doesn't fit their actual location on the globe, which creates artificial discrepancies that are more political than practical. For example, before 1949, China had 5 different time zones because it's so wide. But after the Chinese Revolution, the whole country was set to Beijing time. This decision made political sense, but meant that the official time was out of sync with the solar day. For example, Xinjiang in the West, people would start their workday in the middle of the night due to the time zone consolidation. To deal with this, the local government shifted work hours to start later, creating a kind of local time that is different from the official Beijing time. This manipulation of time zones for political reasons, as seen in China and elsewhere, often aims to project a semblance of unity or control. In Europe, for example, many countries set their clocks ahead of the geographically correct time zone, which places them ahead of their time. Similarly, Russia's reduction of its time zones from 11 to 9 in 2010 illustrates how time zones are influenced by political and other factors. They're not just about geography. They are about politics. The misalignment of time zones with natural longitudinal positions vividly illustrates the intersection of spatial and temporal oppression. Communities who are on the edge of a time zone boundary experience a daily reality that is at odds with the natural world. They are coerced into living by a clock that misaligns with the daylight that they observe. For those communities and groups, timekeeping practices are deeply intertwined with the cosmos and seasonal cycles. For those communities, they find that their temporal realities and their spatial existences are disrupted by an imposed system. This forced realignment not only erases indigenous temporalities, but also reconfigures their spatial orientations, highlighting the dual facets of oppression. They are forced to conform to a foreign temporal order and spatial hierarchy that disregards these ancestral markers in favor of politically expedient borders. This mode of temporal oppression and colonialism is used to maintain and reinforce social hierarchies and inequalities, a tactic that includes the manipulation of historical narratives, the erasure of certain groups from history, and control through a narrative of social progress. The intertwining of temporal and spatial oppression is further exemplified in the lived experiences of marginalized communities within modern urban contexts, and is often linked to other forms of oppression, such as racism, classism, and gender-based oppression, as temporal and spatial oppression exacerbates existing inequalities. For example, Black workers in America who commute by public transportation have the longest time out of all ethnic and racial groups. Long commutes with long waits at bus stops or train stations makes it challenging for people to get to work on time or to go home to take care of their families, which may lead to missed work days and leads to decreased wages and increased financial hardship. In comparison to white households, on average, Black and Latina households in America work more hours to be able to afford rent and other household expenses. For a person who is low income, they may have to work 2.5 jobs in order to afford their rent. This disparity in time equity, a reflection of broader systemic inequalities, exemplifies how temporal and spatial oppressions are interwoven, with time acting as a silent yet formidable axis of discrimination. Temporal imperialism continues to produce its own set of unique challenges. Traditional forms of timekeeping have been left behind in favor of an overly convenient universal system that does not account for regional or cultural particularities. This homogenization has caused many communities to lose an important element of their cultural identity. In the Black community, the timeline from the so-called ending of slavery to the present reflects a society designed to leave Black, Indigenous, and Brown people and families locked out of the future. Western capitalist and colonialist timelines exploit, injure, and reduce the lifespans of Black people, denying us an opportunity to thrive in a future of our own making. Every second feels as if it has been designed to leave us behind, as if every hour has been set against us, and as if every year is a dare for us to continue to exist. Black people recognize this timeline as a weapon that is used to restrict and control our lives. Redesigning our collective timeline cannot be accomplished by a single solitary voice or action, nor even a small group of individuals, like at the International Meridian Conference, where 40 people decided on the time zones for the rest of the earth. It requires shared responsibility and agreement from multiple communities and their branching timelines. It calls for the collaboration of multiple forces from different times, spaces, and narratives. Our positions in time influences our connections to the past, present, and future. And our communal time is formed from a diverse range of times and narratives. Time zone protocols is an ongoing project to rewrite the protocols of time, realigning and restitching the fabric of our temporal spatial consciousness. It unmaps the global imperious colonization of time, pioneering a new era with a Black futurist lens and with colored people's time as an ontology. My research sought to comprehend how oppressive time protocols and policies perpetuate the structural barriers which tangibly impact Black communities in the United States. As I've already shared, these protocols are not neutral. They are active agents of historical erasure and contemporary disenfranchisement, which limits the future of our communities. By dissecting these time constructs, my research aimed to reveal and challenge the structural barriers that deny Black people sovereignty over our own temporal experiences. My artistic research for this project functioned on multiple registers: as a historical inquiry, as a social critique, and as a visionary exploration, not only to uncover and analyze, but to subvert and reimagine. By positioning these protocols as forms of research, the project underscores their generative power, the power to create new understandings and to challenge the status quo. It opens up possibilities for a more equitable and inclusive temporal landscape, where time is not a tool of oppression, but a space of liberation. In 2020, I was drawn to an artistic research fellowship at the Viralis Center for Art and Social Politics at the New School in New York City, with the theme, As for Protocols. And in particular, I was intrigued by their descriptive detail that since a protocol may also refer to documentation and minutes, the term signals a hybrid time frame of both the past and projection into the future. This theme resonated with my research around time zones and daylight savings time. And in reviewing the documents from the International Meridian Conference, I realized that the official 1884 notes and minutes from the conference were subtitled Protocols of the Proceedings, with each chapter a distinct protocol. Over the next 2 years of my fellowship, I researched and developed time zone protocols as an expansive artistic and creative research project, which includes a digital archive, exhibition, and the Prime Meridian Conference, which you are at today. Specifically, my work centered on journeying into the labyrinths of political agendas, social contracts, rules, and norms, both written and unwritten, that scaffold our contemporary Western-centric time construct. In 2022, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Viralis Center presented the Time Zone Protocols exhibition and the Prime Meridian Conference that I curated for the three-day hybrid online and in-person event called the Prime Meridian Conference. I brought together artists, architects, musicians, scholars of physics, geography, technology, and African American studies to explore how space-time can be reimagined using unique social, cultural, and geographical frameworks. Leading up to the exhibition and the unconference, I also convened the Time Zone Protocols Surveyors Discussion Group, a gathering of individuals to analyze and debate the research materials, including an archive of readings, images, sounds, and videos on time zones, time, temporality, prime meridians, and temporal oppression. The discussion over several meetings centered on new ways of understanding our relationships to space-time, utilizing those social, geographical, and cultural frameworks that depart from colonial linearity and shift the standards and protocols of time. Our collective sharing produced a set of alternative principles, protocols, and values that reshape, remap, transcend, deconstruct, or dismantle and create new and equitable time protocols. It is my honor and pleasure to present the second iteration of the Time Zone Protocols installation here and the Prime Meridian Conference at the Leeum Museum in Seoul. Last week, I convened 2 sessions of the TCP Surveyor Group with 20 participants. Some of you are here. It's great to see you. And our collective output includes time maps, tools, and other experiments, which you can see back there in the TZP Surveyor's room. And you can also read the materials that the surveyors looked at and studied prior to the workshops. Over the next 3 days, this space will host a series of workshops and talks, including one on embedded time and annotated dismantlement by Madam Data and More Mother, one on chronicles of broken time, on the possibilities of other temporalities by religious scholar Lee Chang-yik, another session by Wendy Sia is called They Had Clocks, We Had Time. We'll also hear from Young-suk Choi, an artist and researcher who will be presenting on time and ecological grief. We'll have a workshop from herbalist Asia Dorsey, who will talk about shape-shifting and building new worlds with botanicals, so plant time. We'll also have a workshop by V. Mitch McEwen, who is a professor at Princeton School of Architecture, on cloud time and cloud futures. And then Afro-Asia Collective will be presenting Portal Afro-Asia. Together, these gatherings will offer methods of being and existing beyond the limitations imposed by mainstream interpretations of time and space. And beyond the 3 days, the installation will remain open for the next month. During this time, we will continue developing the protocols of time, practices that will directly undercut the colonial foundations of standardized time that was codified by the International Meridian Conference. Our work resists not only the imposition of mandated time, but also the deeper time-centric norms that shape daily life and enforce political control, from the regimented 9-to-5 schedule to the artificial manipulation of daylight saving time. To witness these protocols in action is to be reminded of the richness and multiplicity of temporal experience, our experiences of time, especially those that have been historically ignored, marginalized, or suppressed. This project is an invitation. Take these practices with you, adapt them, share them with your communities to cultivate your own temporal protocols and collective temporalities. We are advocating for a profound reconsideration of how time is structured and utilized as a mechanism of governance and discipline. By proposing new and alternative modes of existence that transcend the constraints of mainstream temporal interpretations, we will dismantle the colonial foundations of time measurement. This will not only liberate us from the confines of imposed chronologies, but will create a multitude of temporalities that can coexist, honoring the rich tapestry of global cultures and their unique conceptions of time. Thank you.
네, 감사히 잘 들었습니다. 어떠셨나 모르겠어요. 어렵기도 하고 저도 사실 이번에 이 프로젝트를 준비하면서 시간에 대해서 늘 우리가 보는 어떤 시간들을 정말 다시 한번 인식하는 어떤 계기를 이제 가졌는데요. 지난주에 저희가 워크샵을 그 TGP 시간 탐색자는 워크샵을 진행하면서 늦는다는 거, 지각한다는 거에 대한 얘기를 좀 많이 나눴던 것 같아요. 우리가 항상 정시에 도착해야 된다는 어떤 강박이 있고 그러지 못했을 때 뭔가 좀 인식이 제대로 된 어떤 인성의 문제다, 뭐 인성의 문제가 있다 이런 식의 어떤 논의들이 있었는데 그런 것들을 이제 지난주 저희가 워크숍 하는 동안에는 잊자라는 이런 얘기들을 좀 했던 것 같아요. 그래서 티를 마시면서 시간을 약간 뭐 음미하면서 천천히 저희가 진행했던 기억이 있고요. 작가님께서 이제 다양한 어떤 시간대에 말씀해 주시면서 특히 이제 뭐 아시아 쪽 관련해서는 중국 관련한 시간의 어떤 얘기들을 해주셨는데 사실 한국의 시간 역시 어찌 보면 다시 한번 생각을 해봐야 될 필요가 있다라고 생각하는 게 제가 뭐 시간에 대한 뭐 해박한 어떤 지식이 있는 건 아닌데 사실 한국 같은 경우도 간단하게 이제 말씀을 드리면 한국 그 표준 자원선 도입이 1908년에 도입이 됐다고 합니다. 그리고 나서 저희가 자체적인 어떤 표준시를 갖고 있다가 1908년 한일 병합 이후에 저희가 일본 표준시를 따르게 됐고 이제 그쪽으로 강제적으로 이제 사용을 하게 됐고요. 그러고 있다가 해방이 된 이후에 이제 이승만 정권 때 다시 저희가 일제히 이제 식민지 잔재를 청산해야 되는 어떤 이유로 한국에 이제 표준시로 다시 돌아갔었다고 해요. 그런데 그러고 나서 어떤 편의와 어떤 일본의 요구로 인해서 다시 한번 저희가 한 1960년대 다시 일본의 표준시에 맞춰서 저희가 원래는 이제 그 자오선으로 따지면 이제 일본은 135도고 한국은 127.5도라고 해요. 30분의 시차가 존재했었는데 그 시차가 어느 순간 갑자기 한일 병합하면서 30분이 사라지게 되고 일본의 표준시를 따라하게 됐고 현재 저희는 일본의 표준시에 맞춰서 지금 살고 있습니다. 그러다 보니까 어찌 보면 저희도 여전히 어떤 식민지의 시간 안에서 저희 어떤 역사와 다양한 어떤 공동체의 이제 내러티브가 서술되고 있잖아요 생각이 들었고 최근에도 실제 2025년 현재 초반에도 어떤 이제 매체들 안에서는 다시 저희 한국의 표준시로 돌아가야 되지 않냐라는 논의들이 있다는 것을 발견을 했고 그리고 또 한편으로는 그 북한 같은 경우에는 이제 2015년에 8월 15일 광복절 맞이해서 그때 이제 일제히 어떤 식민지 시간을 버리고 평양 시간, 평양의 어떤 표준시를 다시 설정을 해서 30분의 시차를 그대로 유지하는 방식으로 갔다가 3년간 그걸 유지한 이후에는 다시 또 일본 표준시로 돌아갔다고 합니다. 지금 그래서 일본과 남한, 북한이 어찌 보면 하나의 표준시를 지금 동일한 시간으로 살고 있다고 보시면 될 것 같고요. 그리고 또 이제 일본 같은 경우는 이제 여러 식민지 이제 국가들, 식민화했던 국가들인데 대만 같은 경우에도 사실 일본에 있는 이제 서부 표준시를 따랐기 때문에 시차가 1시간 정도밖에 안 된다고 해요. 그러다 보니까 실제 저희가 대만과 이제 비행 거리는 2시간 반이지만 시차는 1시간밖에 안 된다는 거. 그런 식의 어떤 저희가 시간대에 살고 있다는 거를 저도 어찌 보면 이번 프로젝트를 통해서 한국에도 이런 어떤 시간의 문제들이 있었구나는 거를 알게 됐다는 점 말씀드리고 싶습니다. 지금 이제 너무 다양한 말씀을 해주셨는데 사실은 이 강연 안에도 있고 여러분이 있는 이 공간에도 그 시간에 대한 다양한 해석과 어떤 이야기들을 영상과 특히 타임라인 아니면 이제 뭐 워크샵의 어떤 결과물을 통해서 이제 이야기를 해주셨는데요. 이제 흥미로운 점 중에 하나는 어찌됐든 이제 그 흑인의 시간, 블랙 앞으로 퓨처리즘을 위해서 시간이라는 걸 하나의 무기로 삼고 도구로 삼고 해방의 어떤 무기로 삼았다는 점이 되게 흥미롭게 저는 느껴졌던 것 같습니다. 특히 이제 작업하신 것 중에도 있는데 CP 타임이라는 개념이 있는 것 같아요. 그건 저도 이번에 그 프로젝트를 이제 경험하면서 처음 들었던 개념인데 CP 타임에 대해서 좀 더 설명해 주시면 좋겠고 그게 실제 이제 흑인들의 어떤 그 시간에 대한 태도나 아니면 관점을 사실은 뭐 조금 더 이제 차별화된 어떤 고정관념으로서 이렇게 말하는 어떤 용어로 사용된 걸로 알고 있는데 CP 타임에 대한 설명을 좀 더 부탁드리고 싶고 그리고 그걸 어떤 방식으로 이제 전유해서 작업을 하시는지 좀 여쭙고 싶습니다.
Yeah, so CPT time stands for Colored People's Time. And in the American context, it has historically been used as a way to stereotype Black people and hold them to a particular time standard. And so when people say, you're on CP time, it's typically a negative thing. It's typically meaning that you are expected to show up somewhere late or not on time or to delay something. And that timeline, I think, traces, no, not that one. That one. That timeline traces some of the histories of colored people's time and how it has showed up. And really the term goes back to the time of slavery, where again, black people, if they weren't supposedly on time by the clock, or if they weren't, laboring at the times that they were told, they were considered lazy or, again, not able to show up on time. And in American societies, and as in many other places, right, showing up on time says something about your personality. You're a better person if you're on time versus if you're not. So that stereotype has held over time to be a negative thing, but people are starting to reclaim colored people's time as a positive thing, as something that demonstrates the different types of temporalities that black communities actually hold that aren't bound to linear time, aren't bound to clock time, aren't bound to the sort of time zones that I just talked about, or the globalized time. And starting in my work, in our work as Black Quantum Futurism, we see CP time as a beautiful thing, as a technology or as a tool. And we see the ways that delaying time or not showing up to something on time is actually better for us, better for our health, better for our ability to navigate through the world. But again, it often cuts against this notion that you have to be on time, you have to be to work on time. But what we've seen, right, is that when you're not on time, the consequences of that go far beyond just, you're a person who's late. But it could mean losing your home. It could mean losing your children. It could mean losing your job. It could mean a lot of different things that really impact people. And as a former lawyer, I've seen it in my work that if someone is 1 minute late, 2 minutes late to court, for example, if I am helping them to try to keep their homes, they will lose their home just by being a couple minutes late to something and not given another chance to do that. But the consequences of that are that they have to leave their home in 20 days and find a new home, right? And if you're a person who is low income, that is almost impossible. So just the different ways that time has been weaponized against black people, but that we can reclaim time as a beautiful thing, as a communal thing, when we embrace colored people's time.
저희가 이제 CP 타임을 이제 경험하면서 한편으로 이제 저희가 코리안 타임이라는 거를 아마 들어보셨을 거예요. 그러니까 저희가 이제 코리안 타임도 한국인의 어떤 시간관이라 해서 이제 늦는 거, 지각하는 거에 대한 이제 고정관념을 많이 쓰였던 건데, 흥미롭게도 이거에 대한 이제 뭐 위키백과나 이런 걸 치게 되면은 이제 이게 이제 한국 전쟁 때 이제 1950년대에 나왔던 말이라고 해요. 그래서 이제 주한 미군 장교들이 한국인과 약속을 한 뒤 사전 통보도 없이 약속 시간보다 늦게 나온 한국인을 좋지 않게 생각했다라는 어떤 순간부터 한국의 어떤 시간, 코리안 타임은 항상 늦게 도착한 한국인을 이제 비하하는 말로 사용이 됐다고 해요. 그래서 이제 그 얘기를 들으면서 뭔가 약간 유사한 어떤 관계성이 있다라는 거를 생각을 했던 것 같아요. 그래서 저희도 어찌 보면 이제 한국 코리안 타임을 저희는 안 하려고 엄청 지금 애쓰고 노력을 하고 있는 어떤 삶을 살고 있는데, 이제 CP 타임이 어떤 거를 전유해서 어떤 다른 식으로 이제 무기화시키는 어떤 모습을 보면서 이거 역시도 저희도 뭔가 다르게 조금 인식해 볼 수 있지 않을까라는 생각을 좀 했었던 것 같아요. 그래서 이런 어떤 한국인의 시간관을 어찌 보면 이제 저희가 저 앞에 포스에 올타임즈 로컬이란 말이 있는 것처럼 한국인만의, 한국 공동체만의 어떤 시간성이라는 게 무엇인지를 다시 한번 좀 생각해 볼 필요가 있다라는 생각을 했던 것 같습니다. 그러면서 또 하나 이제 시간을 저희가 조금 더 지체할 수 있다는 점 말씀드리면서 하나 제가 먼저 질문을 드리고 객석으로 마이크를 넘기도록 하겠습니다. 그 글들을 이제 많이 쓰시고 연구를 많이 해주셨는데요. 보면 이제 그 시간에 대한 다양한 어떤 개념과 연구 중에서 온타임과 인타임에 대한 개념을 조금 잡고 계신 걸로 제가 보았습니다. 그래서 저희가 보면 저스트 타임 키트라는 그 진도 만들고 관련한 프로젝트도 하신 걸로 알고 있는데 인 타임이라는 개념을 어떤 식으로 생각하고 계시는지가 궁금합니다. 온 타임에 빗대어서 뭔가 시간 안에서 시간의 어떤 흐름 안에서 존재하는 어떤 공동체에 대한 얘기를 하셨던 걸로 기억을 하는데 그 부분을 조금 더 설명해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
Yeah, I think the way you described it is exactly what it is. It's this notion that the clock time is not necessarily the true time. What we read on the clock and what we read on the calendar, it is an organizing tool, but it should not be the foremost way that we engage with each other, or it doesn't have to be, I think. And so this notion of being in time is more about generative time, being able to co-create time with other people rather than having time imposed on you. So being in time, being able to feel the flow of time however you want, whether it's quickly or slowly. Thinking about, for example, how a tea ritual with other people can modify our experience of time and being in time with each other, as opposed to fighting the clock, as opposed to running to always catch up with something, or always running to be on time, which is a pinpoint that is always moving, right? It's always something that we can not always catch up with. And when we feel that we can't catch up with it or be on time, right, we internalize that in very negative ways. So, you feel a sense of guilt, or you feel a sense of, that you're not making progress, or that, you're moving into a future that is not of your choosing at a pace that you didn't decide on. So that's the difference between being in time versus being on time, I think, and challenging that pinpoint of the clock time. And it's interesting about the Korean time. Thank you for sharing that. We travel a lot, and we also encounter, when we go to other countries, there will be this sense of local time, and what it means in that particular place differs. So, for example, me and my partner, we spent time in Greece, and there's a Greek time. But that Greek time is not seen as a negative thing. It's seen as a positive thing. It's seen as you slow down and you take 3 or 4 hours to eat a meal and to have a conversation, or even just tea and coffee can take 3 or 4 hours, right? And that Greek time is sort of expected in how you engage with other people. So they're not running to be on time, or, in an American context, once your meal is over, you leave, right? But in the Greek context, you sit there for hours and you drink your coffee and you take the time. Whereas in a South American country that I think I was in Brazil, there's this local sense of time, but it looks more like CP time, and it is considered more of a negative thing, that the people there, indigenous people, don't show up to things on time, and so delay things, right? So there's definitely these local times that mean different things to people, and especially when you compare it to the westernized, globalized sense of time.
네, 답변 감사합니다. 그럼 이제 객석으로 마이크를 넘기도록 하겠습니다. 혹시 강연 들으면서 아니면 이제 프로젝트 공간을 보시면서 궁금하신 점 있으면 가감하게 손 들어주시게. 네.
예, 감사합니다. 지금 말하고 있는 게 이게 이제 기준점을 잡고 그것에 대해 표준화를 하면서 생기는 권력의 관계라든가 뭐 스토리라든가 역사라든가 그런 식으로 되는 건데, 이제 월에도 이름들이 있잖아요. March, 막 April 뭐 이런 식으로 있고, 그리고 우리가 지금 2025년을 살고 있다고 생각하고 그런 기준점이 있잖아요. 특정 그런 것에 대해서는 어떻게 생각하시는지 궁금합니다.
Yeah, I think how I try to look at linear time progression, again, I think of it as as a communication tool, as a tool that helps us to orient ourselves in a certain type of time. But I try not to think of it as the only way of thinking about time. And I find that when I think about time as this linear progression, like we're going to move into 2026 and then 2027, I feel a sense of hopelessness, because those years have already been decided and imposed upon us in some different ways, particularly coming from America. For example, again, I used to be a lawyer, and so I did housing work, and often what I would see is that the government would have a plan for a particular community that is like 10, 20 years into the future that does not include that community. So, for example, I lived in North Philadelphia. There was a plan for North Philadelphia that was like North Philly 2028, right? No one involved, no one who lives in that community had any input on that plan. And so when 2028 comes, this timeline and this sense of time and space will be imposed upon this community without them having any say over what's coming. And so I really try to think about that when I'm engaging in my work and engaging with other communities, that yes, there is this sense of linear time, but we really have to question it and question what it means and where it comes from. Even the year number that we're in, right, it may be different in other communities that don't count 12 months in a year. Some communities have 10 months, or think about just think about that progression differently. Or some communities may go backwards in time, like their years aren't going forward necessarily. So there's different ways that we can tap into. I mean, I think for everybody, it's different. Depending on your job or what you have to do for a living, how you can hold those different types of time. But what I want people to know is that there is some choice there. You don't just have to stick with standardized time. You can make up your own timelines. You can make your own calendar that has meaning for you. We often talk about how we don't feel like we're in 2025. The way that in America things are going, it feels like we're moving backwards in time. Sometimes it feels like we're in 1968 or 1884, right? So me and my partner, we talk about that, and we bring that into how we're thinking about time and the types of tools that we create to help us challenge those things.
Hi, thank you for that talk. It was really interesting. So this is just a pretty general question out of curiosity. So I would love to hear more about your or others' proposals, or solutions to various forms of time oppression of the type that you've talked about, whether it's on a policy-related scale or otherwise. During the talk, I was trying to think of various solutions myself, but they either led to even more oppression or didn't solve anything. I was like, oh, Zoom, work from home, that might, that allows people to buy their time back. But some jobs don't allow for that. And those tend to be jobs held by, say, Black communities in the United States, or in other countries, it's different variants of that. So yeah, I would love to hear more about your solutions and whether you're pessimistic or optimistic about these solutions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the question. One thing I would say is from our workshop last week, there are some examples in that room. If you can't read them, I was able to download a Google Translate where you can just actually take the picture and it'll translate for you. So there's some ideas that folks even came up with last week in groups, right? Because it is challenging to think as your own person, right? Like you can think about your own time, but like how does that spread out to other people and other communities and things that you engage with? And people had some really good ideas like time banks and different types of like community spaces where folks could regain time, intergenerational community spaces. And then if you go on our website, timezoneprotocols.space, there are lots of different ideas from when we did the first version of the Prime Meridian Conference, as well as some tools. So that zine that you have, the Just-in-Time Kit, has some tools for how you can think about with other people in your community or yourself, building out these different ways of engaging with time. I would say in policy, there's also possibilities. I have found that in my work. So again, I used to be a housing attorney, and even in my job now, I do a lot of work around housing policy. And so in Philadelphia, we were able to create a law that really took into account time and how time functions, particularly for people who have been evicted, and those people who get records from being evicted, and how those records follow them forever for the rest of their lives. And those records can prevent them from accessing housing in the future. And so we created a law where that record can't impact you forever, right? Like you can't consider that record beyond a certain time period. Or you have to, a landlord who is looking at a tenant has to consider other factors besides just that record. They are cut off in time from being able to use that record to qualify a tenant in the future. Because again, you could be a tenant who maybe fell on a hard time and had a funeral in your family and was $50 short on your rent. That creates a record that follows you 30 years down the line, right, for just a little bit of money, right? So that time oppression of this eviction record. So being able to create policies that think about that very specifically, think about the time factors that are created in our social policies and laws that really impact people on a day-to-day basis. And again, in America, a lot of the work that I do, we look at these different factors of like, how affordable is housing? If you can't afford your housing, that impacts your time. It impacts your ability to be a whole person because you have to work so much in order to afford your housing. And so how can we make housing more affordable so that people have more time, don't have to work as much, and can be able to spend time with their families or in their communities? So lots of different ways to look at it. And again, it's really going to depend on yourself as well as the kind of people you're surrounded with. And like for every community, there's different ways of engaging with time. Again, all time is local. And so if you can like sort of dig into that and find the sort of localized ways that are positive for your community to be able to engage with, I've found that helpful. So again, like the kind of projects that we've done, we opened a space called Community Futures Lab in Philadelphia that Madam Data was interned at, which was awesome. And that was a space for the community to come in whenever they wanted. We didn't have like set times. It was just about like your own temporality. We would have workshops where people could leave whenever they wanted, right? They could come in whenever they wanted. We weren't like, you have to be here as soon as it starts and you have to stay here until it ends. We really respected people's ways of engaging with time and community and built out a lot of different tools from that kind of space. So those are some examples, but lots of different examples on the website.
네, 아까 뭐 2025년 다음에 2026년이 나온다 이런 선형적인 시간, 정해진 시간에 대해 생각하면 좀 마음에 희망이 없게 느껴진다라고 하셨는데 그 우리가 살면서 표준화된 시간에 따를 수밖에 없는 부분들도 있기는 하잖아요. 그래서 작가님의 그러니까 삶 속에서 개인적인 차원에서 어떻게 그 뭔가 나만의 시간이랄까 아니면 표준화된 시간과 다른 차원의 시간을 실천하는 방법이 어떤 것이 있는지 뭐 좀 효과적으로 내가 살면서 이런 걸 해보니까 좀 좋았다든지 그런 게 있으면 좀 소개해 줬으면 좋겠습니다.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we'll be doing a workshop after this where we'll talk about this as well, and we'll give some examples of other ways. But for me personally, it starts with the little things. So I'm a parent. Because I'm a parent, I have to work. I have to be able to provide for my family. So I do have a 9-to-5 job that I have to follow. But I have found different little ways to challenge my relationship to labor and to work. I used to be a person who one could consider a workaholic. My partner would probably say I still am a workaholic, meaning, I worked more than, on an average day, probably work 15 to 18 hours a day and just nonstop because I had a very unhealthy relationship to working. Once I started to examine that, little things like cutting myself off from work, taking a nap. Like I've started taking naps, which is wild. I would have never done that openly in the past, but taking naps, restoring my body, taking the time to block out my time on the weekend so that I can engage in things like writing, which helps shift time for me, like being able to write. Other sorts of rituals and tools that we think about in terms of how we shift our linear sense of time. So we have this tool called a quantum event map, which brings together different versions of time that's not in the standard or traditional timeline. And then communal time, I think about that. And when I'm with community, the quality of time is so different than when I'm at work. And I really pay attention to what that means and what that looks like. So those are just some things for me personally, but we'll talk about this more in the next workshop. And also, I think one thing that has really shifted my sense of doom and linear time is Afrofuturism. And so I no longer think about when I say like I think about linear time as it makes me feel hopelessness, is like because when we're thinking about linear time moving into the future, again, it feels like it's preset. It feels like for me it's been predetermined by someone else in power. You know, when you think about who's the current president of the United States and the ways in which they're able to manipulate time to make us feel like we're going backwards, or like the future, such as like climate change and these other things, there's this sense of doom. But when I think about Afrofuturism and I think about cyclical time and I think about the time of my ancestors before slavery and the kinds of times that they could engage in, it gives me this sense that we're not running into a future that's going to end or racing into time. I can embrace time in this different way. And it brings a sense of hope to my work as a lawyer and as somebody who has to support other people's futures and ability to access the future, to say that things aren't inevitable. Things aren't predetermined. We can co-create what the future looks like. It doesn't have to be based on the conditions of the past or the conditions of the present. There are other things that we can bring into these futures because it's not just you know, some running timeline that's going to end, which is a very, again, Western thing. When we think about like Christopher Columbus, part of the reason why they were going out and seizing these nations is because they thought the apocalypse was going to come in a few years. And so they thought time was running out. And so in order to extend their life, right, it's buy up all of the land, or not buy, still all the land, colonize people, right, before God ends the earth, right? And I don't want to live that way. I don't want to live thinking that there's an apocalypse coming and we're eventually going to run out of time. And so I choose, it is a choice, and it's not always an easy choice, but I choose to think of time and feel time differently and see it as cyclical. And a lot of tools like Afrofuturism have helped me to shift that.
Thank you very much, Rashid Phillips. Personally, I specialize in French literature and especially African literature. And there was one semester that I taught Afrofuturism to the students, and then they were very interested. But I found it difficult that since they had no background about the history, Afro history, it was difficult to make them to imagine the future, different future, and then to let them know that the time is not linear, and then even the past could have been different than what has actually happened in the history. I found it very difficult. Anyway, today I was very excited to see you, and then I came from far to attend to your conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My question is actually, well, I had so many questions. However, I have to pick one. And then the last question that came to me maybe is, I appreciate the fact that you chose the time as the main theme of your project, artistic and then scientific, I guess, and philosophical. But I guess, as I already told you, it's very difficult to make people to reimagine and then rewrite and unfold maybe, or fold the time which has passed in the past. How do you deal with it? And then I guess the fiction is essential in this process, right? Imagination is essential in this process. Especially, I wonder what was the critical moment that you decided to take this adventure? I mean, chose the time as the main theme, the main subject, something that you have to take as a revolution. How you came to this decision to pick this so difficult thing?
Yeah, thank you for the question and for sharing more about your background. And I can definitely appreciate that it is very difficult to share with people and to have them come to a different sense of time, because we have all of our lives been indoctrinated with this sense of linear time and this sort of limited possibility within that linear time. And I think Afrofuturism does offer something different, but you have to be able to like kind of immerse yourself in it in order to understand the difference, and be able to find a lot of different examples of that to see what could be different. And so, you know, part of it are my book, Dismantling the Master's Clock, that I came out with. There's a copy here, shows some different examples of that, different examples of like very specific examples from other cultures of how people use and think about time differently. So it's not just an abstract consideration, but it is something that people live, practice, have practiced for thousands of years. And so there are examples out there that people can think about and utilize and figure out how it might impact them personally. For me, a lot of this came out of my love of science fiction, actually. I've been a science fiction fan since I was young, and at some point that became time travel, and so I was really obsessed with time travel. But I began to notice that in films and a lot of books, people like me didn't time travel. People who look like me weren't represented in these things. And so I wanted to search more and figure out what does it look like when Black people time travel? And are there different logics that happen? Is there a different time logic that is happening when Black people time travel? And then I was introduced to Octavia Butler's work and her novel Kindred, which stars a Black woman, which has a Black woman protagonist being pulled back into time. And so that really was a moment for me to understand that there are different set of logics, and that those logics look a lot like quantum physics. And what I was learning about quantum physics in terms of how you can travel backwards and forwards in time, when you're not using quantum physics and you're using just regular linear Western standard time logics, the only people who tend to be able to time travel under those conditions are white men, scientists, people with time machines. But looking at how Black people time travel, right, you don't really need that. It's really about, again, this different sense or way of being in time that is not just bound to clock time or calendar time. So yeah, a lot of my interests stemmed from there. And then also just wanting to understand things like, why are the months named what they are? Why are we in the year 2000, whatever? Where is this coming from? And so digging into that history is what opened up my interest into further. Yeah, and then just time is so interesting. It's like endlessly interesting to me. So there's so many different ways that you can think about it and look at it. So yeah.
예, 너무 답변 감사히 잘 들었습니다. 저희가 예정된 시간보다 조금 늦어졌는데 아마 충분히 여기 계신 분들은 양해해 주실 거라 믿고, 저희가 다음 이제 세션이 또 워크숍이기 때문에 그걸로 전환하는 시간을 잠시 가지려고 합니다. 라시다 필립스 작가님께 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. 감사합니다.